70,000 people, and I think if we include tonight, maybe 70,030 or something. It's growing. It's really, yeah, you have to revise your bio. She's an alumna of the Royal College of Art in London, a recipient of too many fellowships for me to, I can't even pronounce them, but even say them would take too long, and has been supported by the Arts Council England, the British Council, and many more. And yes, this year she is the Cavendish Arts Science Fellow. So let's welcome Akila in the way that we normally do.
Just a quick mic change. Thank you very much, James. And I'd also like to say thank you to everybody here for sharing your time tonight. Thank you to the wider Girton community. I started here in October and I felt very privileged and also very warmly welcomed to spend time here. So the first section, we are going to experience a mashup, a remix of two works, which are Ultiverse and Return, and we'll be looking at the poetry and aesthetics of Ultiverse with some of the concepts and visuals from Return. And after that, I will hopefully have worked out what I mean by soul technologies and sacred architecture. The reason I call this talk Just a Feeling is because that's exactly what it is. It's just a feeling, and that's a quote from one of Nina Simone's interviews where she talks about what it feels to be free. And she tells the interviewer, it's just a feeling, like how do you explain to somebody what it's like to be in love? And I think when I'm talking about soul technologies and sacred architecture, it's exactly that. And anybody that engages with faith spaces or even sports spaces or anywhere where we congregate and we channel our energies together will be familiar with that kind of feeling.
Because the soul is not an entity that has a start and an end. The soul is in constant orbital mode between the land of the ancestors and the land of the tribe. And so what happened is that the general impression that they give to the soul is that it goes to the ancestor in order to recharge itself and to build up a purpose or a plan, then takes on a spacesuit, enters the cosmos, into the tribe, execute that mission, then return back to brief or debrief among the ancestors, and to receive again new charges, new mission to be performed.
So my journey with immersive and interactive art began in the sacred spaces of my childhood, in the living rooms and church buildings of first-generation Caribbean immigrants in the north of England. In our gatherings, I witnessed my first masterclass in creating sacred architecture through sound and ephemeral presence. During that period of my life, fellowship meant spirit-led sound baths of singing, praying, praising. I think about the congregational prayer that we used to do. Everyone at once, a shower of voices that would bubble up and somehow know intuitively when to dissipate. How the air filled and how the volumes and intensities of the voices rolled over one another. How thin space became pregnant and how the whole began to swell from its parts. My practice originates from people who lost their ancestral context and so imprint through inherited memories, through feeling and innate knowing. It starts with people who swim in a sea of forgetfulness to survive. Last year, I heard someone refer to dreams and visions as technologies of the soul, And I realized that's what I've been searching for through the digital technologies in my practice, that I've been longing to recreate the feeling of these transformative spaces that emerge with the technologies of the soul. So when I started and I was studying in the third year of my degree, I was mainly making video art. And video art was my gateway into creating with digital technologies. At the time, I inherited the material-focused sentiment that these technologies mainly serve to preserve and extend the lived moment, that through capture, fleeting moments could be made finite and concrete. Eventually, I would return to my original conditioning from people who swim in a sea of forgetfulness where water shifts but remembers its form. Like voice data transforming into light and like emotional frequencies becoming architecture, we exist in this constant state of being here but not here. Everything about us will fade from the scene systems we are making, and there's a liberation in that fading. I'm interested in how digital technologies might actually help us become more ephemeral, more fleeting, how they might help us embrace the natural order of physical erasure while acknowledging spiritual and emotional eternity. It's not about capturing or preserving, but it's about feeling atmosphere while shifting form, creating conditions where we might momentarily glimpse these unseen systems where our collective memories swim. So I'm operating from the principles of technologies of the soul, which are visions, prayers, dreams, prophecies, and spirit-filled gatherings, feelings, and asking our digital technologies to help us dive deeper into a shifting storm of transformation. Asking, can they help us access spaces where the individual dissolves into the collective and where the material opens doorways to the immaterial? This exploration has emerged through several works, and each one has circled closer to being able to curate these ephemeral spaces. So this is an image of Vase. It was one of my first experiments where I saw how simple materials could create profound shifts in space. A data projector sent white lines through a vase of water, basic elements that somehow became more than their parts. I watched as people's apprehension would melt away as the refracting light and gentle sounds would draw them into a shared moment of getting lost together. At the time, I thought it was about the material, but what I was really discovering was how to transform emotional space through the materials. The next work is Ultiverse, which had several forms over a 3-year period. But ultimately, Ultiverse emerged through deep time spent with collaborators, each of us slowly challenging the prescriptive traditions of our respective disciplines. Through months of being together, of letting our practices dissolve and reform, we created a space where vocal undulations became the material of emotion itself. The work evolved into a laboratory where singing and wordless expressions could shape the architecture of feeling that visitors would step into. And like a sea of forgetfulness, each moment was unique, holding space whilst constantly shifting form.
The people faces, the reaction, some of them they were bursting in tears, and I felt engaged and connected. It was like there is a positive energy.
Yeah, and passion.
It's all about humanity.
There has been a day.
The next work is Light Organ, and I co-created this with Simon Fletcher and Adam Glatherin. Light Organ became our first exploration into collective voice as a creative force. It became an experiment in social dynamics and what happens when voice becomes the primary tool for entering into and shaping a work. We watched as people discovered their own ways of using this tool, creating unexpected patterns of interaction and collective creation. For the first time, we weren't just inviting participation, we were creating instruments that allowed communities to shape their own transformative moments and their own temporary sacred architectures. And then finally, we have Return. Return marked a shift in understanding voice as data. Here, the emotional information carried in speech became both material and catalyst. When you spoke into the work answering its questions, it wasn't just about your words being heard. It was about the tone of your voice, the frequencies you carried, the volume and pace of your speech. All of this emotional data transformed into physical presence, creating the pixel arrays that would form your unique environment. Your voice would become architecture, your emotional state manifesting as digital space, present and ephemeral at once. And so this is an excerpt from the web app, which was the final version of the work. Okay, so thank you for listening. Thank you for bearing with me. And yeah, that's the work I've been making over the past several years. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I haven't actually asked Tequila if she was happy to take any questions.
Yeah, that's okay.
I mean, you put me on the spot now.
I'm better with questions than I am with presenting, so yeah,
Okay,
that's
good.
fine. Yeah.
Let's see. Do we have any questions? Or thoughts or reflections or commentary? Dr. Paul.
Thank you so much. That was just so powerful and really thought-provoking. I wanted to ask you about the kind of specificity of it. So how specific is it? Sorry. Is this helpful? How specific is it in terms of subject matter? So just to explain that a bit, I mean, I'm looking at those kneelers. I'm not quite sure what the purpose of those is over there. And thinking that, some people after dinner tonight might go into chapel. And some of the things that you talk about, I wrote down about the individual dissolving into the collective, or communities shaping their own transformative moments, or, that different technologies allow technologies of physical erasure. A lot of that is what happens with the sort of candles that you light in Compline and so on. Is that a fair... is that a legitimate way for me to respond, or is the specific content of what you're talking about in the sort of words that you put on the screen, how important is that, I suppose, as part of the emotional response that we should be taking?
I think it's dually very important and not important at all, which is, that's the answer really. But I think in all of this, in all of the works, the hope is that without knowing any references, without knowing the context of the work, with whatever cultural background you arrive with, you're able to curate your own experience within it and not have a prescriptive checkbox at the end of it of what you must have achieved or gained from it. And at the same time, you can go to the other end of the spectrum where you can deeply get into the kind of spaces that you mentioned. And it is very inspired by these kind of simple technologies, ancestral technologies, like you mentioned, the candles, and just spending time together in a lofty space that was built for a specific purpose, where you can align your energies with other people that have similar intentions. And, you know, it happens in stadiums, in churches, or in any kind of religious setting. It happens in this place, like tonight. And really, it's in not having any outcomes or demands to be productive or to show up in a particular way. You're actually quite freed up to dive into the space and get that value from it, if that makes sense to you. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for a lovely experience. I was wondering, quite a number of your works are co-created and co-constructed. And given the depth of your personal experience that you're bringing, I'm wondering how you experience that collaboration with your creative partners, whether it's a question of discovering something that you already shared, or whether it's more like constructing a tapestry from people who are inherently come from very different perspectives.
I'm going to sound like the cop-out queen, but it's both. So it's like, it's definitely about having a personal backstory that would lead you to that motivation. But I would preface that with the space that I talked about, the church that I grew up in. It wasn't very prescriptive in the sense that you would congregate, but anything could happen, and anybody at any level could instigate that happening and could lead in a sense. So even that was a very collaborative space. It was a space that depended on co-creation. So even though I might have the motivation for the concept, I'm very dependent on the collaborators and the people that participate, the audiences that present themselves to experience the work, and I see it all as a massive tapestry. And I wouldn't even know how to describe my role in that. Like, am I bringing the threads together? I don't know. I wouldn't even go there, but I'm excited that I can catalyst and engage in that way, yeah.
Mistress, please, and then Dr. Phillips.
Thank you, Akila. Amazing. I'm still trying to work out what to think.
That's good.
Which is good.
Yeah.
So we skipped over a bit of a chunk, perhaps intentionally, so don't feel obliged to respond to this, but from your childhood to what you then ended up producing. And I'm wondering, maybe not most, but a lot of people here will have thought, okay, right, now I'm late teens, I'm going to go and study X, Y, or Z. And not many of them would have, not many of us would have come up with this. How did that happen? And I mean, I'm going to give you a second part to this, so that you've got something to skip over diplomatically, which is any wow moments in the Cavendish physics labs?
Yeah. Okay. So the how moments. I think let's think of the best way to summarize this. So I lived in two worlds. I had my Caribbean Pentecostal church, which was pretty much all my time outside of school. And it's not that we were in the church building, but it was the wider community, in people's houses, had dinners together, all this kind of stuff. And that was a very separate world to going to school, predominantly white school, English culture. And so that was like my first fracture, I would say. Then my next fracture was with my own culture when it came to go to university. And, immigrant parents, we came here to make money. You're going to do economics, right? And so that was the second fracture. And then again, when I finally got into studying fine art, it was a culture within a culture that kind of diminished spirituality at the time. It wasn't cool. You had to be conceptual and rigorous and factual. And I think it was just bouncing between these different worlds. And then I think from a personal perspective, I'm quite good at masking. I have probably about 6 personalities that I roll out at different times. And that's if you go into astrology, maybe because I'm Gemini, but also I think just because, you know, you're navigating through all these different worlds and you're deciding how best to show up to stay safe. And I think that's what motivated me to create these spaces where you could just show up and you could plug in and it wouldn't matter if you had whatever was required in order to live in that space. Yeah, and then the technology, because I work with technology, but I'm not a technologist. It's a means to an end, and that's probably why I ended up making this stuff, because it's very hacky and it's not, you know, it's not on any instruction manual in the softwares and the programs and things, and I have tried to turn that into a strength as best I can. So yeah, and what was it about the fellowship?
Well, just wondered if
The
you
wow
had any
moments.
wow moments in the physics.
The physics labs, I guess the wow moment was that realizing it was a church and that there was massive amounts of faith in it, like that it was a church, that they believed in things that were hoped for and not yet seen, that they were the least certain people in the world, in the sense that they were seeking to erase everything they had thought before. They were waiting for a new discovery that would say, that's wrong, what came before. And so that kind of resonance in terms of my cultural background and then also my faith background was brilliant. But the real wow moment was pulling up here, the first day of my fellowship, seeing the buildings, seeing the grounds and thinking, this is another type of church. With its own traditions and its own practices and its own codes, and everything's church, So
Thank you. Yes, what a fascinating and beautiful experience, and I'm really thrilled to have experienced it. My question was actually sort of expanding on that point about experience and your point about church, and particularly focusing on representation in your work, particularly because there was I found it so interesting that you haven't got figures per se, but there's so much reference to particular contexts and culture and places. And I was quite curious to hear more about what this representation means to you, or this particular kind of representation might mean to you, and why that was helpful or important for you. Because I think it seemed very profound and quite interesting.
Thank you. Definitely there's loads of references, and I avoid figurative, literal representation. I started out in video art, and my biggest gripe or restriction I felt with that was, you create a world, you present it to people, and they can't enter it without bringing their world into it. But not the best parts of their world, just the most restrictive parts of their world, whether it's the stereotypes or the preconceptions or whatever it is. And then you have to work very hard to break those down, to build them back up, to truly show them the feelings of your world. And at a certain point, I just thought, why don't we just focus on the feelings of the world? Why don't we remove one of those potential barriers? And can we access the feeling part of the worlds that we're building faster, quicker? And I think that's the main thing, but also I think it was just this idea that people should be able to show up, and they shouldn't, as little as possible, they shouldn't see boundaries to how and why they should show up. In the art world in particular, there can be quite, prescriptive codes that if you don't know, then you didn't get it and you're not in it, and I didn't enjoy that. And I hope some people saw the works that we made, the collaborators, wider community made, that they would enjoy it first of all and not worry about those things. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Hello. It was beautiful work. Really enjoyed it. I want to ask about the spaces that the work has been presented in and the engagement. Do you feel you've learned anything from the different types of spaces that the work's been exhibited in? And sacred spaces, do you think there's something in that in response to the breadth of spaces that your work's been shown in? Do you want spaces to feel more sacred, or are you open to exploring spaces in your work in different spaces?
Yeah, so in terms of the breadth of spaces, the installations have shown from everywhere from public toilets to community centres to cathedrals to museum spaces, and I would say museum and gallery spaces are the ones I've engaged with the least, again because they come with quite heavy history about how you should show up. I've enjoyed the festival spaces, which are typically with the festivals, which is why I have 70,000. It's not that everybody's flocking to see my work, it's that I participate in like very densely attended very densely attended events. The festival spaces I enjoy the most because you're taking everyday spaces in city centres and regular working spaces, shopping centres, and they are transformed by the sacred architecture. And when I say sacred architecture, I'm thinking about the presence and collectiveness, and then the energies that people channel through the different tools when they're present and collecting together. And I've enjoyed that the most because it's so ephemeral. It's there for 2 nights and then it's gone, and it lives in the memories and the feelings that the people had whilst they were there, and there's absolutely no record of it. And I'm going to fold this up. Most of my works, they fold up, or they, the vase, it's just been sat on my shelf for the last 7 years. Like they just go back to being everyday objects, and I enjoy that a lot. And I've forgotten the second part of your question. Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yes, Andy.
I'm quite interested in thinking about where you're going to take your work next. We've seen the history of your work so far. Have you started to think about what the next installation will look like, or what it will sound like, or are you kind of living in the space of reflection at the moment?
I have started thinking about it. So there's 2 ways we can go down this. One, a very practical, logistical way. I need a producer, like somebody else, to come on board and help bring the works into being, and then in a more like let's call it metaphysical way. Is this still on? Am I stopping it? Sorry, can we turn the sound off of this clip, please, Lewis? Is that okay? So in the very conceptual way, I applied to this fellowship with a concept in mind, and it is bubbling and overflowing and doing too much at the moment. But the concept is that I'm interested in exploring water and blood data, so the data that you're born with, that you inherit from all the people that came before you, and that you imprint from the people you interact with. I'm interested in how sound and story and vocals can be used to collaborate with water and environmental data, and that is quite cryptic. As I said, it's an evolving concept, but ultimately I'm just excited about how digital material, digital experiences might be able to extend beyond people that can physically experience the works. And I also imagine it would be quite fun to revisit some of these installations and then give them a bit more of a rigorous presence or installation somewhere in another interesting space that may be sacred, might be not, but yeah. Nandi is also a collaborator. You heard her voice today. Yeah. Yeah.
So interesting. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
So there's a moment when you were talking about your first installation where you talked about people encountering it and getting lost together, which I think could be a great motto for this college. but the motto that is outside of that's in Latin outside of the chapel is "Thus far God has helped us," right? Which I think is adds a really interesting temporality to this idea of divine intervention. Well, so far we've been all right, and I guess that kind of pinged with a thought about someone famous, someone will know this, said that architecture is frozen music. I wonder if your work pushes against that idea, that maybe architecture isn't frozen, maybe it's moving, and maybe there's something kind of animated in it or could be found within it. So it's a question about temporality, about your comments about the college as a kind of church or a sacred space, and this idea that maybe architecture is moving or is sort of, inspirited or animated. I don't know if you...
Yeah, I do. Probably one of some of the more influential contemporary art influences I have is Olafur Eliasson, and he has an essay about how we co-create with space when we move through it. And we're constantly in this state of co-creation, and I think in that way I think about architecture as being ephemeral and moving and animated. But I would also say we are melted architecture, we're just a more dynamic form. How we assemble, how we congregate, and then there's other really interesting things as well with sound, the idea that the sound in this space tonight is locked in the architecture, it's imprinted in the walls and the floor. And in however many years, maybe just 2 years with AI, we'll be able to bring in a machine that can draw back out all the sound and all the presence that was here. And I think even the data, the body scans, the spatial scans of bodies in the work, is kind of thinking about this idea that you've moved through a space and you've imprinted on it, even if we can't grasp onto it in the tangible ways that we can furniture and other more solid matter. And the physicist would say, all of this is very ephemeral, it's just vibrations of molecules and none of it is solid. So, yeah, many tangents.
Yeah.
Many,
yeah.
Yeah.
I think we are running out of time for this formal part of the evening, but thankfully, in a very fluid way, we are going to move
sacred architecture into the
move into that room, where there will be some further spirits in the form of and then we will eventually gravitate that way, where there will be even further refreshments. But before we do all of that, and just to say that in all of this, you can grab Akila, ask her the question that you wanted to ask, and definitely, further engage with this amazing material, and really just so smart.
Thank you for all your questions as well, and thank you for all your patience and time. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Let's give Akila